There were nights when you lay quietly in the darkness for hours, unable to sleep. The room was silent. Everyone outside had already fallen asleep long ago. But your mind still could not rest. You tried to close your eyes, tried to exhaust yourself enough to finally drift asleep. But the harder you tried, the louder the thoughts became. Old memories returned. Words that once hurt you deeply. Disappointments you never told anyone about. The pressure you always pretended you could handle. And then, the tears started falling again. Quietly, silently, where nobody could see them. Nobody knew that behind your daytime smile was a heart so exhausted it barely had enough strength to keep going anymore. You still replied to messages normally, still laughed when people talked to you, still pretended everything was fine. But only you truly knew how tired you had become. There were days when you no longer understood what you were even trying so hard for anymore. You simply continued living out of habit, waking up, doing what needed to be done, then returning to the same familiar room with a heavy heart once again. And perhaps the thing that hurt you the most was not only what happened to you, but the feeling that nobody truly understood what you were carrying inside. So you began keeping everything to yourself. Because every time you tried opening your heart, you felt like you were becoming a burden to others. So you learned how to stay silent, learned how to swallow your sadness alone, learned how to say, "I'm okay," even while your heart was quietly breaking apart. There were nights when you stared at the ceiling wondering, will I ever truly feel happy again? Will this exhaustion ever end? Would anyone really stay if they knew how broken I actually am? Those questions repeated endlessly inside your mind. And perhaps the scariest part was, you slowly became used to sadness, used to pretending to be strong, used to comforting yourself alone, used to sleepless nights, used to feeling lonely even when surrounded by people. There were moments when you simply wanted to disappear for a while, not because you wanted to give up on life, but because your soul had become so tired. You had tried being strong for far too long, carried too many things silently, repeatedly telling yourself, just keep going a little longer. But deep inside, you were truly exhausted. There were wounds inside you that never fully healed. You simply learned how to live with them. There were memories that still hurt your heart every time they returned. There were people who left, yet the emptiness they created still remained inside you. And there were things you never told anyone, because you feared that if you truly spoke honestly about everything, you would break down crying and never stop. So you continued staying silent, continued forcing yourself to stay strong, continued living as though everything was fine. But at night, every mask disappeared, leaving only you, alone with your real pain. And perhaps that was what exhausted you most of all. Not because you were weak, but because you had been strong for far too long. You had carried too much by yourself. Too many thoughts, too much pressure, too much sadness that nobody ever embraced gently. There were nights when all you wanted was for someone to tell you, you don't have to carry this alone anymore. You are allowed to rest now. You don't have to pretend to be strong anymore. But the room remained silent. And once again, you cried quietly in the darkness, just like so many nights before, until your tired eyes slowly closed, until your body became more exhausted than the pain itself. And right before falling asleep, deep inside your heart, you still quietly hoped that one day things would become easier again. One day your heart would no longer hurt this much. And maybe, even during the moments you felt most alone, God was still sitting beside you during every night nobody knew you cried this much. There were nights when you prayed with tears in your eyes, but heaven felt completely silent. You tried to speak honestly to God, tried to tell Him how tired you were, how confused you felt, how badly you needed comfort. But after every prayer, the pain still remained. The loneliness still remained. The exhaustion still remained. And slowly, a painful question began growing inside your heart. God, are you still listening to me? You never wanted to doubt Him. You truly didn't. But suffering changes people, especially when they have been carrying silent pain for a very long time. There were moments when you opened your Bible hoping for peace, but your mind was too overwhelmed to focus. Moments when you tried worship music, but your heart still felt heavy afterward. Moments when you prayed repeatedly, yet nothing around you seemed to change. And because of that, part of you quietly began feeling abandoned. You started wondering, if God is near, why do I still feel this broken? That question haunted you more than you admitted to anyone, because deep inside, you were afraid. Afraid that maybe your prayers were not enough. Afraid that maybe you had disappointed God somehow. Afraid that maybe heaven had gone silent because of something wrong inside you. But the truth was, God was never absent. Pain simply made it difficult for you to recognize His presence. There is a kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the body, a tiredness that settles deep inside the soul. And when a person reaches that point, even hope begins feeling distant. That was where you were. You kept trying to survive every day, while quietly carrying spiritual exhaustion nobody else could see. There were nights when you cried during prayer and eventually stopped talking altogether. Not because you stopped believing, but because you no longer knew what to say. Your heart had become too heavy for words, so you sat there in silence instead. And strangely, those silent moments scared you the most. Because you thought, if I cannot even pray correctly anymore, what if God stops caring about me too? But God was never measuring your worth by how perfect your prayers sounded. He saw the exhaustion behind your silence. He saw the tears you could not explain. He saw the nights when your faith felt fragile. And even then, He stayed close. Sometimes, God's silence does not mean absence. Sometimes, He is quietly holding together the parts of you that are falling apart internally. Even when you cannot feel it. Even when your emotions tell you otherwise. There were moments you survived that you never gave yourself enough credit for. Moments when your mind was drowning in fear, yet you still got out of bed the next morning. Moments when sadness consumed your chest, yet you still continued moving forward somehow. Moments when you felt spiritually empty, yet a tiny part of your soul still reached toward God anyway. That tiny reaching mattered more than you realized. Because even weak faith still reaches upward. And God never ignored that. You thought He was disappointed in your struggle, but in reality, He was walking beside you through every painful moment, quietly, patiently, lovingly. There were signs of His presence you overlooked at the time. A moment of unexpected peace after crying, a verse appearing exactly when your heart needed it, a stranger's kindness during your darkest week. A small feeling inside you whispering, "Keep going." Those moments were not accidents. God was still speaking, just not always in the dramatic ways you expected. And slowly, your heart began understanding something important. God's presence is not dependent on your emotions. Just because you cannot feel Him clearly does not mean He disappeared. Just because your prayers feel weak does not mean He stopped listening. Just because healing feels slow does not mean he abandoned your story. That realization softened something deep inside your soul, because for so long, you thought faith meant always feeling spiritually strong. But real faith often looks much quieter than that. Sometimes faith is simply continuing to breathe while carrying pain you cannot explain. Sometimes faith is whispering, "Help me," when your soul has no strength left. Sometimes faith is surviving another night without completely giving up. And maybe that was exactly the kind of faith you had all along. Not loud faith, not perfect faith, but honest faith. The kind that keeps reaching toward God even while crying. The kind that still hopes quietly during darkness. The kind that says, "I do not understand what you are doing, but please do not leave me." And God never did leave you. Not during the sleepless nights. Not during the panic. Not during the emotional breakdowns. Not during the moments when you almost lost yourself completely. He stayed through all of it. Even in silence. Especially in silence. Because sometimes, God does His deepest healing in places where words cannot reach. And although you could not fully understand it yet, He was still holding you through every moment you thought you were alone. There comes a moment when the soul no longer knows how to keep pretending. A moment when smiling becomes exhausting. When replying, "I'm okay," starts feeling heavier than simply admitting, "I'm tired." And maybe that was where you had been for a very long time. Tired, not only physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You woke up tired. You carried conversations while feeling tired. You went to sleep tired. Even rest no longer felt like real rest anymore, because the exhaustion was not only in your body, it had settled deep inside your heart. For so long, you tried to carry everything alone. You tried to stay strong for everyone else, tried to fix every problem, tried to save every relationship, tried to become the version of yourself that everyone needed. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that your soul had limits too. You gave and gave and gave until there was almost nothing left inside you anymore. There were days when even the smallest tasks felt overwhelming, days when your mind became so heavy you struggled to focus on anything, days when your heart quietly whispered, "I can't keep doing this anymore." But still, you continued pushing yourself. Because you believed stopping meant weakness. You believed resting meant failure. So instead of slowing down, you forced yourself to keep carrying burdens your heart was never meant to hold alone. And eventually, the exhaustion began changing you. You became quieter, more distant. Not because you stopped caring, but because your soul no longer had energy left to explain its pain. There were moments when people misunderstood your silence. Some thought you were cold. Some thought you were uninterested. But the truth was, you were simply tired beyond words. Tired of overthinking. Tired of disappointment. Tired of carrying emotions nobody else seemed to notice. Tired of trying so hard to hold yourself together every single day. And perhaps the hardest part was that you felt guilty for being tired. You blamed yourself for not being stronger, for not healing faster, for not staying positive enough. But healing does not happen by forcing a wounded soul to run endlessly. Even hearts need rest. Even strong people need gentleness. And you had been surviving without gentleness for far too long. There were nights when your body was lying in bed, but your mind continued racing endlessly. Replay after replay. Fear after fear, memory after memory. You became exhausted not only from life itself, but from constantly fighting battles inside your own mind, battles nobody else could see. And because nobody could see them, you began minimizing your own pain too. You told yourself, "Other people have it worse. I should be grateful. I shouldn't feel this broken." But pain is not a competition. And ignoring your exhaustion never made it disappear. It only made your soul lonelier. Deep down, what you truly needed was not more pressure, not more expectations, not more pretending. You needed rest. Real rest. The kind where your heart no longer feels forced to survive every second. The kind where you stop fighting yourself. The kind where you can finally breathe without feeling guilty for slowing down. But for a long time, you did not know how to rest. Because survival mode had become your normal, you became so used to carrying stress that peace almost felt unfamiliar. You became so used to emotional chaos that silence felt uncomfortable. You became so used to being strong for others that you forgot how to be gentle with yourself. And slowly, your soul began collapsing under the weight of everything you never allowed yourself to feel honestly. There were moments when you secretly wished someone would simply hold you and say, "You don't have to carry all of this anymore. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to rest, not because you were weak, but because you were human, and humans were never created to carry endless pain alone." Perhaps that was what your heart needed to hear most. Not another lecture about being stronger. Not another reminder to stay positive. But permission to stop pretending you were okay all the time. Permission to admit, "I'm exhausted." Permission to finally let yourself breathe again. And maybe God had been waiting patiently for that moment all along. Not the moment when you became perfect, but the moment when you stopped hiding your exhaustion from Him, because God never asked you to carry life alone. He never asked you to destroy yourself trying to save everyone else. He never asked you to smile while secretly drowning inside. What He wanted was your honest heart, even the tired version of it, especially the tired version of it. There is something sacred about finally admitting, "I cannot do this by myself anymore," because surrender is often where healing quietly begins. And maybe your exhaustion was not proof that you failed. Maybe it was proof that your soul had been carrying too much for too long. Maybe the tears, the breakdowns, the emotional heaviness were not signs of weakness, but signs that your heart desperately needed rest, needed comfort, needed grace. And slowly, for the first time in a very long while, you began realizing something important. You do not have to earn rest. You do not have to deserve compassion. You do not have to destroy yourself proving your worth. God still loved you, even when you were exhausted, even when your faith felt weak, even when you no longer knew how to keep going. And perhaps that truth softened something deep inside your soul, because after carrying the world on your shoulders for so long, your heart was finally beginning to understand. You were never meant to carry it alone. There were things you once begged God to keep, people you loved deeply, doors you prayed would stay open forever, plans you built your entire heart around. At the time, you could not imagine your life without them. And when those things slowly disappeared, it felt unbearable. You cried over people who walked away, cried over relationships that suddenly changed, cried over opportunities that vanished right when you needed them most. You kept asking, why would God allow this to happen? Because from your perspective, it only looked like loss. It only looked like heartbreak. It only looked like abandonment. And perhaps that was what hurt you most. You did not understand why things you cared about so deeply still slipped away from your hands. There were nights when you replayed everything repeatedly in your mind, wondering what you could have done differently, wondering if you were not enough, wondering if people would have stayed, if you had loved better, tried harder, become more perfect somehow. And slowly, you began blaming yourself for every ending. But not every ending happened because you failed. Some things ended because God saw pain ahead that you could not yet see. At the time, you could not understand that. because attachment makes people blind sometimes, especially when the heart is desperate to keep something alive. So you held on tightly to people who slowly drained your peace, to situations that exhausted your soul, to versions of your future that looked beautiful but quietly carried destruction underneath them. And when God removed those things, it felt cruel, it felt personal, it felt unfair. But healing slowly changes perspective. As time passed, you began noticing things your pain once prevented you from seeing clearly. You noticed how anxious certain relationships made you feel, how some people only loved you when you were useful to them, how certain environments slowly destroyed your emotional peace, how some doors that closed would have eventually led your heart somewhere dangerous. And, little by little, a painful truth began settling inside your soul. Not every loss was punishment. Some losses were protection. That realization changed something inside you, because for so long, you viewed closed doors as rejection. But perhaps heaven was protecting you from things your wounded heart would have kept chasing forever. There were people you once cried endlessly over, who later revealed they were never safe for your spirit. People you once begged God not to remove, who eventually became the source of your deepest exhaustion. At the time, you mourned losing them. Now, part of you quietly thanks God for separating your life from theirs, because God saw what you could not see then. He saw the hidden damage, the manipulation, the loneliness you would continue carrying if those people remained. He saw how desperately you were trying to earn love that should have been given freely. And because He loved you, He refused to let certain things stay, even when removing them broke your heart temporarily. There were dreams you thought would complete your life, plans you thought would finally make you happy. But later, you realized those paths would have led you somewhere your soul could never truly rest peacefully. And perhaps that was one of the hardest parts of trusting God. Understanding that His protection does not always feel comforting in the moment. Sometimes protection feels like loss. Sometimes grace feels like disappointment. Sometimes love looks like closed doors. At first, you only saw what was taken away. But eventually, you began noticing what God saved you from too. Saved you from more heartbreak, more emotional destruction, more hidden loneliness, more versions of yourself that would have slowly disappeared trying to hold broken things together. And maybe that is why some endings happened the way they did. Not because God wanted to punish you, not because you were unwanted, but because your exhausted soul deserved peace more than constant pain. Still, letting go was incredibly difficult. There were memories you continued revisiting, people you still missed quietly sometimes. Moments when your heart still whispered, what if things had turned out differently? That was part of being human. Healing did not erase your ability to grieve, but slowly, your grief became softer, less desperate, less angry. Because deep down, you were beginning to trust that God's decisions came from love, even when they hurt. There is a kind of peace that only arrives when a person stops chasing what God already removed. And perhaps your soul was slowly entering that peace now. You no longer needed to understand every painful ending immediately. You no longer needed every unanswered question explained. You no longer needed to force broken things to stay alive. Because finally, your heart was beginning to realize, if God removed something, maybe it was because He saw how much it was hurting you behind the scenes. Maybe He loved you enough to protect you from futures your wounded heart could not yet recognize as dangerous. And maybe, one day, you will fully understand that some of the greatest blessings in your life were actually the things God did not allow to remain. Even when you cried over losing them, even when you misunderstood Him, even when His silence hurt, He was still protecting you, quietly, patiently, lovingly, just as He always had been. For a very long time, you believed your value depended on how much you could endure silently. You thought being strong meant never falling apart, never crying too much, never needing help, never admitting how exhausted you truly were. So you learned how to hide everything. You smiled while your heart was breaking. You comforted others while secretly drowning yourself. You told people, "I'm okay," even during the nights when your soul felt unbearably heavy. And eventually, pretending became automatic. So automatic that even when someone genuinely asked if you were all right, you no longer knew how to answer honestly. Because somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that your pain was something you had to carry quietly. You feared becoming too much for people, too emotional, too sensitive, too broken. So instead of opening your heart, you kept tightening it, holding everything inside, until your exhaustion became impossible to ignore anymore. There were moments when your body felt physically tired, not because of work, but because your soul had been under pressure for far too long. Moments when even simple conversations drained you. Moments when your smile felt forced. Moments when you wanted to disappear somewhere quiet, just so you would not have to pretend for a little while. But even then, you continued acting strong, because you thought rest had to be earned. You thought slowing down meant failure. You thought people would only stay if you remained useful, positive, and emotionally stable all the time. But that kind of pressure slowly destroys a person from the inside. No heart can survive forever while constantly hiding its pain. And perhaps that was why your soul became so tired. Not only because of what happened to you, but because you never allowed yourself to fully breathe afterward. You never gave yourself permission to stop carrying everything alone. There is a certain loneliness that comes from constantly pretending. A loneliness that quietly whispers, "If people saw the real version of me, would they still stay?" That fear followed you for a long time. So you became careful. Careful with your emotions. Careful with your honesty. Careful not to let anyone see how deeply you were struggling. But healing began the moment your heart became too exhausted to keep performing anymore. The moment you finally admitted, "I cannot keep pretending I'm okay." That honesty frightened you at first, because vulnerability always feels risky to wounded hearts. But God was never asking you to perform strength for Him. He never asked you to smile while secretly suffering. He never asked you to carry pain silently just to prove your faith. What He wanted was the real version of you. Not the polished version, not the emotionally controlled version, the honest version, the tired version, the version of you that cries at night, the version of you that feels afraid sometimes, the version of you that no longer has answers. And maybe that was why surrender became so important, because healing often begins where pretending ends. There were nights when you finally stopped trying to sound strong in prayer. You simply whispered, "God, I'm tired." And perhaps that was one of the most honest prayers you had ever spoken. Not dramatic, not perfect, just real. For the first time, you stopped trying to impress heaven with strength you no longer had. You stopped pretending your heart was not hurting. You stopped pretending everything was under control. And slowly, something inside your soul softened. Because carrying pain honestly feels lighter than hiding it endlessly. There were still difficult days, still moments when sadness returned unexpectedly, still moments when your old habits whispered, "Hide it, stay strong, don't let anyone see." But now, your heart was beginning to understand something new. Rest is not weakness. Needing comfort is not weakness. Crying is not weakness. Being human is not weakness. And maybe you had spent too many years punishing yourself for being human. You expected yourself to heal perfectly, to recover quickly, to always remain emotionally steady. But wounded hearts do not heal through pressure. They heal through gentleness, through grace, through honesty. And God had been offering you that gentleness all along. Even during the seasons when you were hardest on yourself, there is something deeply healing about finally realizing you do not have to prove your worth through suffering anymore. You do not have to carry impossible burdens just to deserve love. You do not have to constantly sacrifice your own peace, trying to keep everyone else happy. You are allowed to rest, allowed to slow down, allowed to admit, I need help too. And perhaps that truth changed your soul more than anything else, because for the first time in a very long while, you no longer felt trapped inside the role of the strong one. You no longer felt responsible for carrying everything perfectly. You no longer felt ashamed of your exhaustion. Instead, your heart slowly began learning how to breathe again, how to exist without constant pressure, how to sit quietly without guilt, how to rest without feeling undeserving. And maybe that was where peace quietly began entering your life again. Not through becoming stronger, but through finally allowing yourself to stop pretending, through finally admitting, I'm tired, and hearing God gently whisper back, I know, come rest now. Healing did not arrive the way you expected. There was no sudden miracle. No single morning where you woke up and felt completely whole again. No instant moment where every painful memory disappeared forever. Instead, healing began quietly, so quietly, you almost missed it at first. After carrying sadness for such a long time, your soul had become used to survival, used to heaviness, used to expecting pain every day. So when small moments of peace finally began appearing again, they felt unfamiliar. There were mornings when your chest no longer felt quite as heavy as before. Not completely light, but lighter. There were nights when you cried less than usual. Nights when your mind finally became silent for a few moments before sleep. And although those moments were small, they mattered more than you realized. Because healing rarely arrives loudly, most of the time, it enters the heart gently, like warmth slowly returning after a very long winter. There were still painful memories inside you, still scars, still unanswered questions. But something inside your soul had started changing. You no longer felt trapped in endless darkness the way you once did. For the first time in a very long while, hope no longer felt impossible. There were moments when you caught yourself smiling naturally again. Tiny moments, brief moments, but real ones. And afterward, you almost became emotional, realizing how long it had been since your happiness felt genuine. You were beginning to feel alive again. Not the old version of you. That version had changed too much through pain. But perhaps God was not trying to bring back the old version of you anyway. Perhaps He was creating someone softer, someone wiser, someone who understood pain deeply, and therefore could understand grace deeply too. Healing changed the way you spoke to yourself. Before, your inner voice was full of pressure. Be stronger. Stop crying. Why are you still hurting? But now, your heart was slowly learning gentleness instead. You began allowing yourself to breathe, allowing yourself to rest, allowing yourself to heal slowly without hating yourself for the process. That alone changed so much inside you. Because wounded souls heal differently than untouched ones. They heal carefully, slowly, in layers. And God was patient with every layer of your healing. Even during the moments when you became frustrated with yourself, there were still difficult nights sometimes. Still moments when sadness returned unexpectedly. Healing was not linear. Some days your heart felt peaceful. Other days old wounds reopened again. But now, those difficult days no longer convinced you that healing had failed, because your soul had finally learned something important. Progress is still progress, even when healing feels slow. And maybe that was one of the most beautiful things God was teaching your heart. That healing does not mean becoming emotionless. Healing means becoming safe enough to feel again without drowning in the pain. Safe enough to trust again, safe enough to hope again. There were moments when simple things began feeling beautiful again. Sunlight through a window, quiet music late at night, a peaceful prayer before sleeping, a deep breath that no longer felt heavy, ordinary moments that once felt impossible during your darkest seasons. And slowly, those ordinary moments became evidence that your soul was healing. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, there were parts of you that still felt fragile, parts still learning how to trust peace. Because after surviving emotional pain for so long, your heart had become afraid of losing happiness again, afraid that peace would disappear the moment you allowed yourself to enjoy it. But God was gently teaching you, peace is not something you must fear. You do not have to live expecting disaster all the time anymore. You do not have to remain trapped inside survival mode forever. Your soul deserves rest too. Your heart deserves healing too. And maybe, for the first time in a very long while, you were beginning to believe that. There is something sacred about realizing you survived every season that once convinced you it would destroy you. That realization changes a person, because once the soul understands, I survived, hope slowly begins breathing again, and hope changes everything. You started praying differently now, not only asking God to remove pain, but thanking Him for carrying you through it, thanking Him for staying beside you during the nights you nearly gave up completely, thanking Him for healing parts of your heart you once thought would remain broken forever. And perhaps the gratitude became part of your healing too. Because looking back now, you realize something important. God was healing you even during the seasons when you thought nothing was changing, even during the silence, even during the waiting, even during the nights when your tears felt endless. He was still there, still working gently inside your heart, still rebuilding your soul piece by piece. And now, although healing was not complete yet, you could finally feel it happening, slowly, quietly, lovingly, like light returning after darkness, like breathing again after nearly drowning emotionally, like warmth touching a heart that had been cold for far too long. And maybe that was why your soul no longer felt completely hopeless anymore, because after everything, you were finally beginning to understand. God truly was healing your heart. My child, I saw every tear you cried in silence. Every night, you stayed awake while the world around you slept. Every moment you felt like your heart could not carry the pain anymore. I saw it all. Even the tears you wiped away quickly so nobody else would notice. Even the silent breakdowns you never spoke about. Even the moments when you smiled in front of others while secretly feeling empty inside. I was there. I never left you. Not once. I know how tired your soul has become. I know there were nights when you felt completely alone. Nights when your thoughts would not stop racing. Nights when sadness sat heavily inside your chest and refused to leave. Nights when you begged for peace, but only felt silence. And yet, even in that silence, I was holding you closer than you realized. My child, you have carried pain for too long. You have tried to be strong for everyone. You have forced yourself to keep going even when your heart was exhausted. You kept telling yourself, just survive one more day. But I never created you to live burdened by endless fear and emotional exhaustion. I never asked you to destroy yourself trying to hold everything together. I never asked you to pretend you were okay while secretly drowning inside. Come to me honestly, not as the version of yourself that tries to appear strong, but exactly as you are now, tired, wounded, emotionally exhausted. Because I still love you completely, even now, especially now. My child, you do not need to prove your worth through suffering anymore. You do not need to carry every burden alone. You do not need to earn rest. You are allowed to breathe again. Allowed to slow down. Allowed to let your soul rest in my presence. I know there were moments when you questioned if I still heard your prayers. Moments when heaven felt painfully quiet. Moments when you thought, maybe God has forgotten me. But I never forgot you. Not during your darkest nights. Not during your panic. Not during the moments when you nearly gave up completely. I stayed beside you through every tear, every heartbreak, every silent battle nobody else could see. And, my child, I am still here now, even while you are listening to these words, even while your tired heart is searching for comfort. You survived so many things that were meant to break you. You survived heartbreak, loneliness, disappointment, fear, emotional exhaustion. And although you felt weak sometimes, you kept going. That strength did not come from nowhere. I carried you through moments you thought you would never survive. There were times when your soul wanted to collapse completely, but somehow you still woke up the next morning. That was not an accident. That was my hand gently holding you together. My child, stop punishing yourself for being tired. Stop hating yourself for needing rest. You are human, and humans need gentleness too. You have cried enough. You have carried enough. You have fought silent battles long enough. Now, rest. Rest your thoughts. Rest your fears. Rest the anxiety you keep carrying alone. Rest the pain you keep replaying in your mind every night. You do not have to hold everything together anymore. Place your exhaustion into my hands. Place your broken heart into my hands. Place your worries into my hands. You were never meant to carry life alone, and even now, I am still protecting you in ways you cannot yet fully understand. Some doors closed because I was protecting your peace. Some people left because I saw the pain they would continue causing your heart. Some delays happened because your soul needed healing first. Nothing about your story has been wasted, not even your tears. I can still bring beauty from your pain, healing from your heartbreak, peace from your exhaustion, hope from your darkness. My child, I know the future sometimes scares you. I know part of you still fears being hurt again, but you do not have to face tomorrow alone. I will walk beside you one day at a time. When your mind becomes heavy again, come rest with me. When fear returns at night, come rest with me. When sadness tries to convince you that you are alone, remember these words: I am still here. I always will be. And one day, you will realize that even during your darkest season, you were never abandoned. You were being carried. So tonight, stop fighting so hard to survive every thought. Stop forcing yourself to stay strong for everyone else. Let your soul breathe. Let your tired heart rest. You do not need to fear rest anymore, because resting does not mean you failed. Resting means your soul is finally safe enough to heal. And my child, healing is already happening inside you. Slowly, quietly, lovingly, just like the sunrise arrives gently after the longest night. So close your eyes now. Breathe slowly. Release the weight you have been carrying. I am watching over you. I am protecting you. I am healing you. And no matter how exhausted your heart has become, you are still deeply loved. Always, forever. Now rest, my child. You have cried enough.